The third session of today's deep dive sessions is meaningful stakeholder engagement. And our host, you will have already seen this morning, is Suhasini Singh, Head of Supply Chain Engagement at Fairware. And she'll be joined by an expert contributor, Annabelle Mers, Associate Director at Fairware.
Thank you, Barbara. And to open, I'll invite Annabelle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the next session where we will look closer at the concept of meaningful stakeholder engagement. As said, Suhasini and I will be your host for this next half hour. We are both part of Fairware's management team, overseeing the tools that we implement and facilitate in the garment producing countries, as well as overseeing the stakeholder networks in the production countries. So throughout the day, you've heard about the importance of engaging with stakeholders as part of human rights due diligence. We know that stakeholder engagement is an integral part of doing human rights due diligence, and we know that it is or will be a mandatory practice in the due diligence legislation. So the what is clear, but the how may not. So we at Fairware also see that this is one of the key concepts in the law that we receive the most questions about, as there are many different questions about what this entails, how do you do this in practice, and what makes it meaningful. So this is what we will touch upon briefly during this session, although scratching the surface because there is so much to say about this. So firstly, we would like to start with a question to you. And as you've been practicing, you can do that by joining us on Slido, scanning this QR code, or going to slido.com and enter the code that you see on the slide here. I will just give this 1 second for you to join, and then we will go to the question. So the question to you seems a very simple one, and we've heard different participants of the talk show today talk about it, but we'd like to hear from you. Why do you engage with stakeholders? So again, if you'd like to participate in this question, please join us at slido.com, or you can also use the QR code to join. We already see some answers coming in. To build trust, to know them better, to identify common goals and jointly resolve them. So all, of course, already part of really the purpose of doing stakeholder engagement. Get more perspective of human rights in the production countries. So surely this is already on a lot of the participants' minds. Answers are still coming in, but a follow-up question to this as well, while people are still typing, is for you to already consider and think about, when is it most helpful? So in what stages of doing your due diligence is it most helpful? And we see already understanding the reality. I will move to the next slide with the questions, but thank you for already answering this one. So the next one is, when is stakeholder engagement most helpful for you? Great, already a lot of answers coming in. Which stage as the beginning of the supply chain, but also throughout, at the start of our partnership. Some of it is still, of course, as to why. Great, thank you so much for including your input here. Most of them is also throughout, help with the remediation. Excellent, thank you so much. We will move on and I will then look at the next slide to hand over, and that will be to Suhasini.
Yes, thank you, Annabelle. And the responses to the second question, of course, resonates with how we interpret meaningful stakeholder engagement. And this is based on years of working with stakeholder engagement in the last 25 years. If done in a meaningful way, stakeholder engagement empowers stakeholder in producing countries. So worker representatives, trade unions, CSOs, community representatives, etc., to inform due diligence process based on their lived experience and valuable insight. Fairway with its partners, trade unions, labor rights organizations, business association, is uniquely placed to ensure this framework is adopted by the industry and referenced by the EU regulators. This way, we work towards a collective approach and avoiding the risk of individual parties and brands implementing it and interpreting it in their own manner. So to bring some harmonization in the interpretation of meaningful stakeholder engagement. Yeah, and you may have seen the HRDD cycle by now, I mean, several times, or definitely 1 or 2 times. So meaningful stakeholder engagement is an integral part of all these 6 steps of HRDD and the core of doing effective due diligence. It is one of the key processes that can bring about positive change in the garment and textile industry. It is recognized by the industry as a key game changer to leverage power imbalances. From step 1 of having your policies shaped up by stakeholders to identifying potential harms, meaning determining what are the most significant harms in your supply chain should be based on stakeholder input. Most of the consultants, brands, or due diligence tools stop there. They engage with stakeholders on risk identification. However, more importantly, stakeholder engagement is needed to complete this cycle and adhere to the dynamic and continuous process of due diligence. Because, I mean, I'm also referring back to some of the response was at the beginning of the partnership, for example, or to remediate a complaint. It's not just 1 or 2 places that we see meaningful stakeholder engagement, but in the entire cycle. Stakeholder engagement is also necessary in defining what is needed to address potential harms and to remediate actual harms. And lastly, to validate that the measures taken have actually had the intended effect. Have risks been adequately prevented, mitigated? Did the actions usually lead to mitigate the harm? So these are the things that we can check if the meaningful stakeholder engagement is continuously done and throughout the cycle. Yeah, here international due diligence standards distinguish between stakeholders broadly and right holders. Under international due diligence standards, companies should prioritize meaningful engagement with the right holders. The term stakeholders is broad and includes anyone whose interest could be affected by the company's activities. In the garment sector, stakeholders include workers, trade unions, community members, suppliers, and other business partners like logistic providers or non-merchandise procurement, investors, employees, customers, etc. But the right holders are a narrower group. Right holders only include individuals and their representatives who are at the risk of human rights abuse from a company's activities or in its supply chain. Some international standards and legislation use the term as affected stakeholders to refer to right holders. Some key right holders for in our sector, in the garment sector, includes workers and trade unions, surely at manufacturing or finished goods and fabrics, trims, I mean, all the other processes of garment making, farmers and workers at the cotton farms and other raw material production, and community members, for example, where severe environmental pollution contributes to health impact on communities. Over to you, Annabelle.
Thank you, Suhasini. So now that we have the basics and the definitions out of the way, let's talk a bit more about what it can do for you as a brand. If done well, brands can better manage potential and actual harms on human rights due diligence due to their operations, as the continuous engagement can inform you on how to address certain harms and where to put your efforts in first. This means you can also target your resources where it's most effective and also most needed. And we've heard some of the participants of the talk show earlier in the morning say as well, there can be a discrepancy between, for example, what is found in audits or other sources of information versus what stakeholders on the ground say. So as a brand, you need the input from those stakeholders, as you don't want to chase the wrong thing to fix it. Additionally, if you make them part of the solution, that solution has the potential to last longer and to have a greater impact. If rights holders are part of this process and part of the remedy, this solution is very likely to sustain for a longer term. So building strong partnerships with stakeholders can be beneficial to brands. Having those relationships can also help support you in the events of sudden change in the context of the country. So for example, when there's a sudden conflict or change in the dynamics of the country, in the laws, that is where you also need to be able to rely on these relationships. So in summary, this can make you more resilient in addressing potential harms, and it can ensure that there is also clarity on the prioritization. So through the due diligence legislation, stakeholder engagement is an individual obligation, yet we are convinced that it only works if in a collective approach. This is difficult, of course, as a brand, because you also need engagement that is tailor-made to your supply chain and to identify the actions that are specific to your supply chain. And that is an obligation that is still with individual brands. While at the same time, you also want to benefit from existing and collectively gathered information. And to that end, there are also a lot of tools and input already available. But more importantly, we want to, of course, reduce the burden of this, both for companies to do stakeholder engagement, but particularly for the stakeholders. We do not want brands individually to reach out to the one trade union in a specific country if there are hundreds of brands who need to do this type of engagement. Meaningful stakeholder engagement is also not a one-time physical meeting. And the last bullet, that's a very, very important one, because we see different interpretations of doing this stakeholder engagement and how to make it meaningful. Let's not make this another tick off the list exercise with one meeting and then you have done your stakeholder engagement. No, it is really part of this continuous process, and the outcome must also feed back into the different stages of human rights due diligence, as Suhasini also just explained, with ideally also a feedback loop to the stakeholders that you have engaged with, as in consider what is in it for them and why are they consulted, what do they get out of it, where is their input used, and what does that lead to? So on these last two bullets, what we believe is a role that can be considered as an honest broker or an organization that can facilitate this. That is because of the collective approach and it not being a one-off exercise that makes it really complex for brands to implement this. And there can be practical limitations such as language barriers or not knowing who to select as stakeholders. There might be unknown stakeholders and so on. So we believe that to make this more meaningful, you would need the role of an honest broker, and to be clear what meaningful stakeholder engagement is. To that end, FAIRWARE has defined that the principles and the framework of meaningful stakeholder engagement needs to look at a specific set of criteria, and also offers a structure in which this engagement can take place. However, for the risk of this becoming too much of a sales pitch, there are, of course, also others that can support you with that in the production countries themselves. So at the minimum, let us ensure that we have consensus on what it entails, what is meaningful stakeholder engagement, what are the principles around this. Some of our multi-stakeholder collected information is also already available in the Academy. For example, when we launch in an in-depth access level, the country risk information that we collect, which is based on analysis from all of our previous assessments and inputs, but as well as some thorough stakeholder consultation from employers associations, local NGOs, trade unions, governments in the production country. And that is already multi-stakeholder validated information that we can offer. There's a lot more needed to that, and we are, of course, very much happy to engage with brands who have further questions on this. And for that, you can also reach out to the Academy, where we can talk about how to best support you in this. Suhasini, I'm handing back to you for any other additions, and then before we can move to a Q&A session.
Yes. Well, there is a question that is on Slido, which I think is very important, and I would like to share exactly something that you ended with. So the question is, how do I know which stakeholders to engage with?
Yes, exactly. Well, that is where, of course, you need a starting point. So first defining who do you know as your stakeholders already, going through other networks, particularly the ones that you have associated as relevant for your supply chain in your garment producing countries, who can also then be part of an assessment of who else should be included in this consultation. So going through your channels in the production countries would be a means, as well as going to MSIs or organizations like FAIRWARE and others that have networks on the ground and can also identify who can be potential unknown stakeholders. So there is, of course, already desktop review data available, but to dig deeper, you would need to do a lot of follow-up questions with the stakeholders that are in your first circle, and to also then primarily look at, for example, worker representatives and others to refer you to the stakeholders that might not be known to you. And it could also not all be covered in the first instance, right? This can also be a process where in the first type of engagement, you identify in a second stage what other stakeholders might be affected that you need to consult.
Yeah. I would also add that because it is stakeholders in the supply chain, so also go deeper in the supply chain and what risks come with your deeper supply chains because of the informality that increases, and then the farmers also come in the picture, environment, of course. So try to study your own supply chain a bit better, and then see who are the the organizations or trade unions that can represent the interest of these stakeholders, right holders in your supply chain. Thank you, Annabelle. There's another question. With what stakeholders does FAIRWARE work / collaborate with?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we mirror the same multi-stakeholder approach that we also apply in our governance structure and in how we collect input and perspective from different sources, and that is to have a balanced view. So we always engage with both the worker representatives, trade unions, as well as employers associations. Then we have a very critical partners that we have for international networks, as well as housed in the production countries themselves through labor rights NGOs and civil society organizations. And then a critical stakeholder as well is our relationships with national governments. So both on national production country level as well as here in Europe. Those are the partners, of course, that all are all around Fairware's work, defining what the industry needs, where the consensus needs to be, where do we need to seek alignment. And for us, the connection between the input from the production countries and how to channel that to either regulators, retailers, or other organizations in Europe, US, or elsewhere, is where we see a key role to channel those different perspectives and make them part of the whole value chain stakeholder consultation. And that is where I think we need each other, because it's difficult for individual brands to do so.
Yeah. And if I can add, we talked about trade unions as a stakeholder, an important stakeholder to engage with. And related to that, we are also in a strategic partnership with Dutch trade unions. And in the countries, we work with their partners very closely. So they also help us inform on the relevant risks, but also in terms of in the manner we interpret the meaningful stakeholder engagement. Who are the critical parties? What does it mean? What does engagement mean? What is continuous? So we are also working very closely with them on the ground as well. Here, in defining the normative principles on the ground on risk prioritization and the credible stakeholders to engage with. There's yet another highlighted question. What resources do you offer in the Academy that can help us with stakeholder engagement?
Excellent question. So firstly, much more on the concept. So that's in theory, in learning modules, in addressing what does it mean and how to make it meaningful, but more on a conceptual level. This is also part of the first access level, where there are much more guidance and learning modules available around this topic. Yet if you go deeper to the Academy, we also present country-specific information. And that information is based on stakeholder engagements through Fairware and its partners, which enables brands to also do their risk scoping on country level based on gathered information from multi-stakeholders in the garment-producing countries. On the framework of multi-stakeholder engagement itself, perhaps Suhasini can share a bit more on how we define the principles around that, and how brands could also make use of this tool and request Fairware to support.
Yeah. So indeed, Fairware, along with its partners, 5 other partners, which spans throughout the supply chain, is developing a framework on meaningful stakeholder engagement. And there are 5 principles. So it's not on top of my head, but there are some very critical elements like safety of the safety, confidentiality, trust. And what does it mean for the stakeholders? What does safety mean? So just by saying that stakeholders should feel safe in engaging with brands, that's not enough. What does it mean? Then there should be no repercussions with the voice or the issues that they raise in the consultation. Do you also follow up? It's not just that in the next 2 days things will happen to the person or to the trade union, whoever raised the issue, but just being in touch and following up. So in terms of principles, we are defining or going much more deeper in terms of what these principles around meaningful stakeholder engagement looks like. It's in a draft stage, so at this point we cannot share it with a larger audience, but we are in the process of testing the MSE frame, the Meaningful Stakeholder Engagement Framework through a couple of pilots, learn from the pilot and then feed into the framework so that it is, I mean, principally sound indeed, but also it is practical, that things have been tested on the ground and then fed back into the framework so that when it is out for the industry and for the regulators to see, they know that it is implementable. This thing can be done and followed through in the entire course of HRDD cycle. Okay, the next question we do have, I mean, for one more question perhaps, how is meaningful stakeholder engagement incorporated in CSDDD? Would you want to take, this is also a bit technical, which touches upon the law.
Yes. So we know that in CSDDD there's a dedicated article on meaningful stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, Article 13, if I remember.
Yes, and explicitly also using the terminology meaningful. However, in the German Supply Chain Act, we know that it's much less visible, although there is, through the regulators, a very clear point of attention that it is essential, considered essential to doing your due diligence. So yes, there's a reference to it explicitly in the CSDDD, where it is also meant, I believe, to say that this is a continuous part, so it's not a one-off. They also consider this as part of this dynamic and continuous cycle that due diligence is. And that's what I know. So the details of the article, I don't know at the top of my head, but it is definitely included.
Indeed. And so while CSD mentions meaningful stakeholder engagement, it also defines stakeholder engagement. What it doesn't do is how it should be done, and or the principle that it should follow, or the assessment criteria that it was indeed done meaningfully. So those things are as such not very well articulated in CSDDD, and that is where Fairway, along with its partners, is trying to fill that gap. So interpret it in detail and how, and the principles around the meaningful stakeholder engagement, that is more laid out. And the idea is then we take it to the wider industry, also to the regulators, to show that we have done it together. It spans the partners working on the framework are from each segment of the supply chain, so all the knowledge is there. Also, labor rights organizations. So it's not just MSIs and sitting here, sitting in Europe, but also trade union partners and labor rights organizations. So basically, all the intelligence is in there. And I also talked about doing a pilot, not just one, but we aim to do at least 3. So testing the framework, and then feeding back into the framework on how well to what extent the principles are practical, and if we need to tweak it, change it. Yeah, lessons learned from the pilot. So we are trying to fill that gap and hopefully have an harmonized understanding of what meaningful stakeholder engagement is and how it can be done on the ground. Right. We are towards
Yes, I think we have to conclude this session. Also looking at the time, and thank you for looking into the questions. Many thanks to an engaged audience and for listening to this. The last question actually is a really great segue to our next session, which is much more about the legislation. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to the moderator.